Hi everybody, and welcome to this Masterclass today. I'm Craig Needham, Director of Real Estate here within Cool Planet.
I'm Philip Riley here, head of the design and commissioning and data acquisition team here in Cool Planet.
Excellent. We were just chatting actually the other day, Phil, weren't we, about the challenges at the moment that real estate especially is going through. Obviously coming out of COVID, there's issues with migratory workforce, whether buildings are up to full occupancy or operating at a lower occupancy. We have challenges for building operators around reporting mechanisms and frameworks that they have to adhere to. So things like CREM, GREBS, LEED, ISO 50001. And the reality is actually that these are great frameworks to help provide a viewpoint for the operators and the owners, but they still rely on a very vital piece of information. That's the initial data that you would put in there in terms of kilowatt hour consumption and the baseline year that you would choose. And for me, I think that's where one of the biggest challenges presently sits, because there's a lot of assumptions that are put into these frameworks. The reality is that to get the quality of information that you need, there's effort that's required to actually gather that information together. And it's not just about reporting against it, it's where does that data come from? Can you get validation of that data? Can you put assurance behind it? And almost as you would do with any other reporting mechanism, if it was a financial reporting mechanism that you had to adhere to, the assurance is very important. And I don't know if you've had many experiences with how you gather that data and where it comes from.
Absolutely, Craig. And the last 4 years have been obviously, very tough years for a lot of commercial building operators, because they obviously previously may have had max occupancy. So they would have been dealing with buildings that were kind of running at 100%. They would have had, a lot of various different reporting structures based on that kind of occupancy. Where now, with the last couple of years, the way the workforce has changed, the way people are working from home a lot more, there's remote working. You might have some days where your occupancy is huge in a building, and then other days where it could be down to maybe 10 or 15%. It can be such a stark difference. And we're finding that a lot of these people are now starting to struggle with how their reporting was done, 3 or 4 years ago versus now, and how they're expected to report on these things. But the point about having accurate data is never truer, because we've come, as you mentioned there, we've come across so many of these situations where they've had to provide various different pieces of data to these reporting frameworks, and the data is only as good as what's being provided to the framework. If there's a situation where you're not dealing with correct and accurate data, those frameworks can be just thrown out of alignment so very quickly, and it just means that then you're not actually showing the true picture of the performance of the building. I've come across a couple of examples recently where buildings have been basically sold or perceived to be very, very efficient, but the data that they were using to put into these frameworks was completely inaccurate, and the cost to try and get buildings upgraded can be varied a huge amount if you don't have the correct data. I don't know if there's any sort of points you've come across similar to that.
Yeah, that's interesting where you say actually there's almost an assumption that people are data ready. Especially perhaps if they've got a new build that's recently been handed over, it's been commissioned, it's been signed off, it's been accepted. So the assumption there is generally that the metering assets are installed, the infrastructure is readily available, and that's the data that can be utilised. But I suppose that's then the key thing in terms of, can you validate that? So actually physically checking those meters, have those meters been calibrated? Do they correspond to what's being pulled back into either the energy management system or the building management system? And can you collaborate with utility metering to actually benchmark and say, well, this is the cumulative value of all the metering assets that we've got, and does that add up then to what the utility meters are providing? Because it's not uncommon for utility meters to be wrong as well.
No, and that's actually something we've come across quite often. And it may only be a couple of a percentage that they're out by, but a couple of percent on a big energy bill is actually quite a significant amount. One example I came across recently with a commercial building here in Ireland that we've actually integrated with is things like return temperatures, flow and return temperatures on boilers and AHUs, which are vastly inaccurate versus what the actual true figures were. And straight away, you're already on the back foot in terms of verifying that data, in terms of using that data then to go and make improvements. there was a huge amount of historical data available for this particular site going back 3 or 4 years, but because no one had ever actually looked at it over the past while, they were instantly in a situation where that data from the past 3 or 4 years was almost useless. They're now starting a process where they're going to have to reconfigure their system, look at it, look at the performance of it over the next few months, rather than just having to get down to it and start making performance improvements straight away.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a huge task for a lot of places, is that you come back to the point about they think they're data ready. They may necessarily have the data there to be ingested into the platform, but it's not necessarily any good, the data. And straight away, they're now into a situation where the next year is effectively just trying to produce a baseline before they can actually really go and actually start to make some improvements.
Yeah. What's the preferred route in terms of getting connectivity to these sites and then being able to validate that information?
Yeah, we're extraordinarily flexible on that one. So the typical life cycle that a lot of our clients would take would actually be to provide us with some historical data. So that might be in the form of a CSV or an email attachment that can get sent directly into our Cool Planet OS platform, and we can build effectively an offline version or an offline digital twin of their building. When that gets a little bit further down the road, we can do a live integration. So with some very cost-effective hardware, and hardware that doesn't need any great deal of third-party effort to install, we can actually start to pull a live data connection from the likes of a BMS or an energy monitoring system. And that means then that the data that they're getting in their platform is extremely fresh. It's up to the minute data, and it's giving a really good live view of the situation that's in the building, the environmental conditions, and also things like the status of all the plant as well. You discover a problem as and when it happens, as opposed to when it's too late.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine once you've got all that information in there and you can overlay it and you can apply the context, that's then when you can also see those issues. Like you say, is the plant equipment operating as it should do?
Yeah.
Do all the meters add up to what the main incoming meter is telling us? Can we then validate that and put the assurance behind it? And you're quite right with plant operation. We've seen it quite frequently whereby the assumption is that the building management system is set up correctly. Again, whether it's a new build or retrofit or a long-standing infrastructure, but the assumption that that's been set up to operate as efficiently as it can be as well. The challenge there can be, especially during the new build and construction phase, that programs are tight, programs are condensed, items are value engineered, so where there should be information and quality information coming back, that's probably been VE'd out of the package.
Yes.
So it's been condensed right down, and fundamentally, I suppose, as long as there's heat coming into a building or cooling, then environmentally, most people are happy because the environmental conditions are satisfied. But it doesn't mean then that that's operating efficiently. So you may have plant equipment fighting against one another. And we've seen it, in buildings in the middle of winter when there's plenty of free cooling from external sources. The chillers will be operating. There's no demand in the building because you can see it in the delta T across the flow and return. But the operators expect that because that's what the BMS system is telling it to do, that it's correct. So things just are left. Yeah. But actually getting all of that information, that wealth of information into the platform enables you to put the context behind it and be able to see those insights and try and understand what's happening within it.
Yeah, and it's an important point that you make there about, plant and equipment fighting against each other. And it's only when you can see all of those pieces of plant, all of the different assets that are in a commercial building together is when you actually start to see the full picture of it. So as you know yourself, with the experience that you have, BMS systems obviously have a facility for trending data, but you might be looking at maybe 1 or 2 data points singly and not the whole picture. So you might only start to realize what the actual building is performing like when you can see 30, 40, 50 data points together in a dashboard, something that's actually really easy to follow. And then it's when you start to see the fluctuations in all of the data.
Yeah. It's that analogy between having good data versus bad data. Just because there's data there, it doesn't necessarily mean
it's good.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Completely correct.
And I suppose also that's where having the experience, like you've mentioned, of being able to understand building operations, so not just data insights and how to gather the data, but it's that engineering expertise, the first principles of engineering when you can go onto sites and see exactly what's happening within there. So We've seen examples where, you can see in the data that there's plant equipment fighting against each other. But actually, once you get on site also, you can see that things aren't configured correctly. So even mechanically, they've not been configured correctly and set up to be operating as efficiently as they can be. But all of that being able to understand the building operation and the energy in use and the energy intensity, I suppose that's the follow-on step, isn't it? From once you've gathered the data and you've got the insights and the assurance behind where you're getting the data from, then it's that operational in use and trying to understand how you can get that energy intensity as low as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on the point you made there about, there's obviously a lot of data there, but there could be incorrect data. Something else we come across quite a lot at the time is the fact that during the handover phase of a building, something hasn't been completed. I was in another commercial building actually recently where I discovered that there was a lot of outstations. It was actually a very well put together building, but it was just that final 10% that it was missing. There was meters that should have been connected that weren't, and that final 10% would have just made a huge difference to the data that they actually have. So sometimes it's just almost there, and it actually doesn't take a huge amount of Capex to get it to that complete stage either.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to the likes of verifying meters, they can actually be just very simple things that have gone wrong.
Yeah.
They're very easy to correct with your BMS engineer.
Yeah. And that adds value to the building overall,
Absolutely.
the asset as it stands, if you've got that infrastructure in place.
Yeah.
Because I suppose there's important decisions that building operators and owners need to make in terms of just looking at the cost of energy for a specific asset and trying to understand whether or not it's a good asset or a bad asset. If you can identify the energy intensity and then, try and map out actually what's the capital expenditure that might be required. Is it worthwhile investing in that asset? Will it potentially become stranded over the next few years? Is it even worthwhile offloading that particular asset as well?
Absolutely. No, that's a huge thing. And I know that there might be a perception that if a building is not worth doing anything, or you might look at its consumption figures over the past 2, 3, 4 years, depending on what they are, there might immediately be that perception that it's not worth doing anything with, let's get rid of it, let's sell it. But even with a very small Capex cost to actually try and get some accurate data on the building by implementing an energy management platform like Cool Planet OS, it means then that you can add value to that building straight away, even without having to do anything in terms of upgrading the building. You now have a genuine, accurate baseline, so the next owners know exactly what they're getting into.
Yeah.
That's probably an awful lot better than an unknown quantity, I think, for most of these companies.
Definitely, yeah. And it might, once you've got that accurate information as well, it might even change the perception of whether or not it becomes a stranded asset or not.
Exactly.
It actually might be worthwhile investing in, because potentially the risk associated with it is that if you're out by, circa 500,000 kilowatt hours, which if you're getting incorrect information because you're not gathering the data correctly and you're not putting assurance behind it, that could potentially add anywhere between 1.5 to 2 million euros of capital expenditure to get the asset to net zero, to get that difference, the delta between the two values down. So it's so important to get that level of information and to accurately understand what's happening within those buildings.
And that can then feed into the overall estate of a building. If there's certain buildings that are just easier to offload at that point, then you've brought your overall pathway to decarbonisation by quite a significant amount.
Yeah. I suspect also it gives people then the opportunity to even challenge their own sort of maturity of their carbon reduction plan once they've got that level of information. So if you can get that individual asset view, the overall portfolio view, and again see the energy intensity, a lot of that can be improved via operational improvements. So again, looking at the integral elements of the BMS controls, if there's strategy changes that need to be made to improve efficiency, look at what can be done from, as you mentioned earlier, there's a challenge at the moment in terms of building operation because of that migratory workforce. But actually buildings are probably set up to be very static in terms of operational and occupancy. So it might be that things need to vary dependent on how many people are physically in that building at any given time.
That's it. I think there's an awful lot more thought now compared to, as I mentioned at the start of the call, 3 or 4 years ago when buildings were at maximum occupancy. There is an awful lot more thought and an awful lot more changes that need to be made at small levels now to actually adjust for that. You might find that for 3 days a week your building is at 100% occupancy, and then for another couple of days it's only at 10% occupancy. It's those small changes that need to be made that actually bridge the gap in between the huge occupancy and the limited occupancy.
Yeah, definitely. And then obviously it comes into the fact that once you've got that data, the next logical steps are trying to understand what is required to take that particular asset on the journey to net zero carbon, and whether the timelines are 2030, 2040, 2050. 2030, it's less than 7.5-6 years away now. So it's a challenge in terms of trying to get a number of buildings down to that level of operational performance.
I think it's also worth mentioning as well that just because there's plenty of frameworks in place for all of these, there is obviously a topic of best practice to be adhered to here as well. I mean, just because you're trying to adhere to a particular framework, of which there are many, there's obviously ways of running these buildings that should be rolled out across an estate. And just because the framework says this doesn't mean you can't do better than it, I guess. And obviously there's going to be situations where you can only go so far, and the framework may just fall out of alignment a little bit. But just the best practice thing for me is just a big topic of it.
Yeah. And again, I think that only really comes from understanding that operational and use side of things, and what's relative to that particular asset as well.
Of course.
There's influencing factors like time, temperature, operational time, temperature, occupancy levels within a building, and they will be specific to that individual asset and what it's utilised for. And that's what really the frameworks don't allow enough flex for, in terms of how does that improve based on that physical asset and its location and all of those other influencing factors.
Of course.
So it's interesting, whilst we're very much in agreement with those frameworks, and if we can get data into the CPOS, that actually will help facilitate reporting against those frameworks as well. And so but it's giving that quality and quantity of data that becomes important, because it gives people confidence then.
I think where there is also a little bit of hesitancy, we've seen this from some of our clients, is that they have a very comprehensive BMS system, for instance, or a comprehensive metering system, but they do come across a lot of challenges depending on whether the building is owned by them or it's just rented by them. I think there's a lot of challenges with the perception that a BMS system can't be made to be smart or can't send its data out to external sources. There's never really been a situation where we haven't been able to overcome that challenge, I'm glad to say, because there's always a way to do this. We're very well experienced at integrations across the board in terms of commercial buildings or even in the industrial space. So I think it's worth mentioning that even if you think you can't do it, it's worth the conversation anyway. Because if you can even get a small amount of data into a platform like Coolpan OS, you're really starting to make some great strides towards that net zero. Yeah,
definitely. It's almost like the art of the possible. It's a conversation.
That's it.
We'll try and work out the solution.
That's it, exactly.
So it's good. I mean, in terms of actually what the real impact needs to be is everybody is striving towards that net zero carbon goal, and whatever timelines are associated with that. But if the building efficiency is improved, it's then about looking at what needs to be invested in terms of maybe physical plant upgrades, in terms of maybe electrifying the heat, self-generation, looking at if there's more efficient ways of air movement around the building as well. But again, that all comes from understanding what is the physical demand within that building.
Correct.
And that goes back to that point about data. You can hang your hat on the data if you've got assurance behind the data, and you're able to then calculate what's the most efficient way of doing things and where is the capital best spent. It is a challenge for a lot of building operators to be able to juggle all of these different issues that they've got to deal with, as well as actually making sure that the building is operational and everybody's kept a comfortable temperature and everybody's happy.
I think we often deal with commercial building operators that have so many buildings within their estate. It's very hard to keep track sometimes of all of the different operational changes and efficiencies that are being made. I think to have an energy management platform just makes that so much easier. You're tracking it actively. It doesn't require a huge amount of day-to-day effort in terms of trying to pull reports from various different systems. The data is there, it's in front of you already, and it's really, really easy to to see where the changes are working and also where they're not working as well. I mean, a lot of this kind of stuff, it can be trial and error, especially when you're dealing with buildings that can be at low occupancy and high occupancy at very, very different times of the day or even the week, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point actually, because it's a dynamic process, isn't it? There's not just one fixed approach that needs to be taken. And as the building does naturally change, then your approach to managing that building and keeping on track with that net zero carbon target needs to flex as well. And actually having that live connection is what gives you the ability, because you know everybody is sort of striving to understand what's required to get to net zero carbon, but it could change. You know, as we mentioned earlier, it could change because of inaccuracy of data. It could change because of building use and operational aspects. So it's good to be able to have that live understanding and also a live model actually in terms of how you're going to reach net zero carbon, so you can accommodate for those flexes, but ultimately it becomes a continuous improvement process, because these savings have got to be maintained.
Yeah, absolutely. And that again is something that we've come across beforehand, you know, that we have so often seen that people go to great strides to get their data available to a platform, whether they're getting it via reports or whether they're getting it on live dashboards, but they get to a point where they think, okay, that's great, everything's good now, and they let that watchful eye slip. They're not looking at it anymore when they think they get to the right place. And it's then so easy for someone that might be local to a building to come and change something so small as a set point for a temperature. Things go out of whack straight away, and suddenly now you're trying to get things back on track. It's that constant, you know, as I said, watchful eye over it that just makes such a difference. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're looking at, you know, a platform 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but it just means every now and again you just have a check, make sure things are on track. And it's very easy for us to put in things like baselines and set points in our platform to make it very obvious when things are starting to slip.
It becomes immediately visible, doesn't it?
That's it.
It's like you say, it goes back to that assumption that it's been set up correctly, it's been operated correctly, and you know it just needs to be left. But the reality is you can't. You need to be tracking it and monitoring it consistently. So I mean, from our perspective, we're very much obviously in agreement with these frameworks, because it gives a global view in terms of perspective of operational assets and portfolio of buildings. But the key thing is, as we've said, it's about getting the accuracy of data in there. Can you validate where the information is coming from? Can you put the assurance behind it? Can you put that accountant's hat on and say, yeah, I'm happy with those numbers and we're going to stick by those?
Exactly.
The variances in numbers can make a big impact.
Huge. And I also think then, you know, we're not here to try and kind of press anyone into going and doing everything from day one. These things happen in stages. It's very important that we start with some historical data first, get that data right, get it accurate, as you said, and then we can start to work towards something where you're seeing a live view of your building at that particular time. And again, just to reiterate my point earlier on, we've never come across a situation where we can't start to pull some data for a building at a very, very live point of view. So if there's anyone out there who's kind of worried about, I can't connect my BMS to the internet, or I can't get data off it, it's not something we're concerned about ourselves. It's always possible.
So don't be put off by the challenge.
Don't be put off by the challenge. The challenge is worth it then in the end.
Definitely. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you very much for that, Phil.
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate it.